Welcome to this installment of Context Clues, where we give you excerpts from previous episodes to help make the new topic at hand just a little bit richer. I'm your host, Chelsey Weber-Smith, and this is American Hysteria. Thongs. Thong, 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 thongs. Yes, dear listeners, this is the next humble offering to you from your team at American Hysteria. I feel confident that our millennial and Gen X audience will remember the massive craze of the early 2000s when women and girls were hiking their thongs up above the waist of their low-rise pants, their midriff revealing spaghetti-strap tank tops, allowing the underwear to really take center stage. The trend, known as the whale tail, worried parents, pissed off principals, and led to constant media commentary about just what this meant about our increasingly skankified, wayward young women. Next week, we will begin by reliving the uncomfortable landscape of popular culture at the turn of the millennium, where a handful of landmark moments made a generation of girls long for a thong of their own. Though we may have been the first teens to embrace the whale tail look, we were far from the first to embrace the thong itself. In fact, it seems like every decade had some controversy that was kicked up around the thong, and of course, the ass of it all. We've got some true whale tales coming up for you next week, going all the way back to the 1920s, when the G-string became the most popular item of the emerging burlesque and striptease culture. Then we'll see how, throughout the 20th century, this tiny little scrap of fabric caused moral panics, legal dramas, police raids, and public protests, and come to the realization that perhaps more than any other piece of clothing, the thong has been imbued with a mythic power, sometimes a halo of protection, and other times something to be hunted down and killed off, lest it take over the entire country. To begin, we'll return to the early 2000s, when a scandal so outrageous rocked the nation that nothing would ever be the same. Super Bowl halftime show 2004, Justin Timberlake and Janet Jackson, an incident eventually dubbed a wardrobe malfunction that would reveal so much more than the pierced nipple of one of the biggest pop stars of all time. It's a perfect encapsulation of how the early 2000s treated women, their bodies, and their sexuality, and how the media and the masses found creative ways to consistently shift blame onto their shoulders and away from America's innocent men. Luckily, this mini episode is a cool 13 minutes, so we can include the entire thing to really get us acquainted with the sometimes awful tone of the early 2000s. So please enjoy this full little episode from 2019 called Wardrobe Malfunction. More than 84 million Americans saw it, the greatest spectacle of 2004, one that would appear in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most popular search item for all of the internet that year. As Justin Timberlake beatboxed and freak danced in some retrospectively unflattering baggy khaki pants against a leather-clad Janet Jackson, their Super Bowl halftime show culminated with Justin singing the line from his massive hit, Rock Your Body. I bet I'll have you naked by the end of this song. Then came the infamous moment as Justin reached across Janet's body, grasping beside her right breast and pulling the black covering away, revealing a large, blazing sun nipple piercing. The video cut away quickly as fireworks sprayed into the sky and Janet looked down, mortified it seemed, at what would go on to be a pivotal moment in popular culture and would even affect the upcoming election of George W. Bush's second term.
Tonight, Janet Jackson is apologizing for her flash dance. The singer calls the bodice-ripping move by fellow entertainer Justin Timberlake during the Super Bowl halftime show a last-minute stunt that went too far. Timberlake called it a wardrobe malfunction.
The incident, unsurprisingly, became known as Nipplegate, and I remember the moment vividly. It was one of those wonderful shocks of live television, reminding me of another incredible moment in pop culture that happened the year before. That's right, when Madonna kissed Britney Spears at the VMAs and I sat wide-eyed on a lounge chair at my boyfriend's house thinking, oh sweet Lord Jesus, I am so deeply gay. Anyway, Janet Jackson's nipple was exposed for 9/16 of a second, but to moralistic Americans, it seemed as if a pornographic assault had taken place in the Dorito-dusted heart of America, the NFL. MTV, who produced the halftime show, would immediately apologize, calling the incident, quote, unrehearsed, unplanned, completely unintentional. Representatives for Janet Jackson tried to explain that in rehearsals, it had been agreed that Justin would rip off Janet's breastplate at the end of the song to reveal a red lace bra underneath, but that Justin had accidentally ripped off the bra as well. The whole nation got insanely mad at Justin. Oh wait, sorry, I forgot about the patriarchy for a second. Let me try that again. Everyone got insanely mad at Janet, and Justin pretty much got off scot-free. Shortly after, Donald Trump, in a reference to his Apprentice TV show, recorded a message for broadcast saying, quote,
Janet, that was disgusting. You are fired.
The Washington Post's Tony Kornheiser wrote, quote, what Janet Jackson did was bizarre, deliberately flopping out of her costume like that. Justin's grabbing hand is entirely erased from the scene. The senseless sexism didn't end there. CBS came under fire for the broadcast and demanded a videotaped apology from Janet in which she said sorry for the costume reveal gone wrong. In the video and in an accompanying written statement, Janet claimed full responsibility for the incident, stating that the red bra reveal was her idea alone and that she had planned it after the final rehearsal without the knowledge of MTV, CBS, or the NFL. That apology wasn't enough, however. While conservative groups, politicians from both parties, and the TV police themselves, the FCC, launched a crusade against immoral content in the media, Janet was equally humiliated by left-wing commentators and talk show hosts who joked endlessly about the incident. In one particularly awkward David Letterman interview later that year, Janet was subjected to repeated questions and jokes about the controversy, even though she appeared visibly uncomfortable talking about it and clearly just wanted to promote her new album.
All right, let's run through this now. Tell us exactly what happened from the time you got up on Super Bowl Sunday to the time the episode took place during the halftime show.
I don't want to relive any of that.
All right.
I mean,
you don't mind if I ask you some questions about it, though? So how did it happen? What exactly transpired?
Dave, you're going to make me relive this. I want to put all that behind me.
Well,
I truly do.
Well, not me.
Justin, on the other hand, cruised through the wardrobe malfunction with comparative ease. While Janet was disinvited from that year's Grammy Awards, Justin was not only allowed to attend, but also performed. Janet was blacklisted by CBS from radio and music video channels for the next several years, contributing to multiple album flops, while Justin got to goof around with his dorky pal Jimmy Fallon on SNL and would go on to pad his career with popular film appearances. Justin's comments in interviews from 2004 range from glib statements such as, quote, hey man, we love giving y'all something to talk about, to self-pitying ones like, quote, I'm frustrated that my character is being questioned. To his credit, though, he did acknowledge 2 years later that he received only a small share of the blame for the spectacle and that Janet had been treated unfairly.
You know, I think that America's harsher on women, and I think that America's, unfairly harsh on ethnic people.
Revolutionary statement, Justin. All the while, people started uploading to the internet grainy captures of Janet's breast taken from VHS recordings. It caused a sensation in the era before video sharing websites had caught on. In fact, YouTube co-founder Jawed Karim revealed years later that the website was partly born out of his frustration at not being able to find the wardrobe malfunction clip online. At that point, Janet publicly wondered why the country was fixated on this single nipple, while potentially illegal American wars were raging in the Middle East and homelessness and AIDS plagued the nation at home, and it appears she was onto something there. Some commentators and sociologists think that Americans were looking for a distraction from the post-9/11 grim state of affairs, and the media circus certainly gave them one. The FCC in the Bush era was forcefully backed by the advocacy group Parents Television Council, whose founder, L. Brent Bozell, referred to the halftime show as, quote, the lowest common denominator of sleaze, and recommended that, quote, an outraged public needs to make this backlash long and commercially painful. In response to the controversy and with bipartisan support, the House of Representatives passed legislation to raise the minimum fine for on-air indecency to an unprecedented $500,000 per count. Though the Senate would later lower the number, the Super Bowl incident caused CBS to be fined a whopping $550,000, a penalty that would later be struck down in court. FCC Chairman Michael Powell, son of George W. Bush's Secretary of State Colin Powell, stated at the time that he was watching the halftime show with his family before it was, quote, tainted by a classless, crass, and deplorable stunt. Michael Powell condemned the halftime show and made statements to multiple news outlets, assuring the public that this level of indecency would not be tolerated on television. However, in a 2014 interview, Powell admitted that his hardline attitude during the whole ordeal was just an act, a role that his job required him to play as head of the FCC. Powell also told of the actual moment he watched the controversy unfold. He wasn't gathered around the TV with his innocent family, but rather his game day buddies, shooting him back, trying to relax on a Sunday when the incident occurred, and Powell said, quote, my day is going to suck tomorrow. Even though infamously sweepy George Bush said he was napping during the halftime show, he was still able to ride a typical conservative wave of panic against indecency and immorality on TV. It led to an almost instantaneous refocusing on moral values that included, of course, the sanctity of marriage, meaning opposition to gay marriage. And Janet Jackson's nipple acted as a kind of sleight of hand. It was a convenient distraction, as Janet had mentioned, from issues of American foreign policy, and it bolstered his poor approval ratings and may have even given him the edge he needed to win the election in November of 2004. As for the Super Bowl, the NFL opted to forgo younger acts for a while and signed Paul McCartney to perform at the 2005 Super Bowl. Apparently, they also chose to forgo female performers for a while, and the next woman to perform at the Super Bowl halftime show would be Fergie, who appeared with the Black Eyed Peas in 2011. That's 7 years later. Even though all those years before, Justin gave us that profound statement on sexism and racism, he has yet to acknowledge a 2018 online petition demanding that he formally apologize to Janet, a petition that's amassed nearly 10,000 signatures and the hashtag #JusticeForJanet. We've never actually figured out if this event was a wardrobe malfunction, as Janet Jackson called it, or a really wild and admittedly awesome publicity stunt. Whatever it was, the fallout certainly demonstrated a lot of Americans' values at the time, a resurgence of this moralistic outrage that punished a black woman and seemed to bestow even more privilege upon an equally culpable white man. It created a social earthquake for a time, just with one truly dope nipple piercing. But for much of the country, the sight of that nipple was a moral devastation. A moral devastation that could only be solved by war criminal and somehow retrospectively adorable in comparison childlike painter and anti-gay crusader, America's own cowboy baby, George W. Bush. And now it's hardly surprising that our current commander-in-chief once called Janet Jackson disgusting while completely leaving Justin Timberlake out of the picture. Justin Timberlake performed in the Super Bowl again in 2018 in a performance that I would call lukewarm. So instead, today, let's raise a glass to justice for Janet. May she continue to sing and dance with that blazing sun always over her heart. More after this. And now back to the show. In a way, we can't really blame the boomers who were angry over those breaching whale tales of the early 2000s. Sorry, that was a really gross way to say that. Because there were big conversations going on then about the sexualization of American girls by popular culture. The belief that the trends trickling down might mean that there was a bigger problem at hand, that it would make them unsafe, that it would make them act older than they were, that it meant that they were deriving their self-esteem solely from the sexuality they could offer to the boys. And of course, many of us will remember the narrative of boy distraction, that the clothing girls were choosing to wear was disrupting the learning environment for the uncontrollable young men who apparently turned into stupefied werewolves at the sight of an exposed thong. We know that every generation of teenagers push the boundaries of those that came before, especially when it comes to sex. And this has been true all the way back to what we're calling the invention of the teenager in the 1920s. We're going to revisit an early episode now that should better give us an idea of what teenagers of every era were up to behind their parents' backs, and the many moral panics and even urban legends that their new behaviors sometimes elicited. So please enjoy this excerpt from our 2019 episode called Teenage Sex.
But I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
As we're all well aware, President Bill Clinton certainly did have sexual relations with that woman, 22-year-old White House intern Monica Lewinsky, over a period of a couple years in the mid to late 1990s. America had dealt with hints of presidential infidelity before, but Clinton's specific actions, as well as his comments about them, would go on to spark a sudden national debate about just what did count as sex and what something like oral sex meant for the future of morality, an act that parents definitely saw as just as bad as sexual intercourse, if not worse. There appeared to be an increasingly casual relationship to alternative sex acts, and parents feared that this liberal attitude might be infecting their children, who were simply growing up too fast in this modern, sex-crazed culture, battered from all sides with images and talk of sex, 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 from Hollywood to television to magazines, and now to the leader of the free world himself.
Get ready, hold on to your underwear for this one. A rainbow party is an oral sex party. It's a gathering where oral sex is performed, and rainbow comes from all of the girls put on lipstick, and each one puts her mouth around the penis of the gentleman or gentlemen who are there to receive favors and makes a mark in a different place on the penis, hence the term rainbow.
In the early 2000s, the suburban legend of rainbow parties that kids had been whispering about for a couple years was largely popularized to parents by that single mention on the Oprah Winfrey Show, awakening them to the nauseating new sexual reality that their kids were living in. The original story came from, of course, a writer's inaccurate book about teenagers' sex lives, aptly called Epidemic: How Teen Sex is Killing Our Kids, in which she treats Allison, a 13-year-old who allegedly attended one such party, and as a result was diagnosed by the author herself as having PTSD related to the event. Guidance counselors began treating rainbow parties like a serious concern, as gossiping teens shared rumors they had heard about the more promiscuous girls. A young adult book called Rainbow Party was published, which used rainbow parties as a teachable moment, and soon warnings of these oral sex parties became common at presentations on high-risk teen behavior.
Another sex panic occurring around the same time was spurred on by this same conversation around sex acts other than going all the way. Also known as shag bands, sex bracelets were those cheap jelly bracelets in different colors that come in and out of style. Depending on the color of the bracelet, young girls were apparently signaling their potential for various sex acts to wanton boys, or displaying the prizes they had gotten for already performing the acts. This color code ran an impressive gamut of possibilities, from the tame, like kissing and hugging, to oral sex and intercourse, to the shocking, like analingus and fisting. The color codes in every story on these sex bracelets varied, as did the methods by which this new phenomenon was functioning. Some adults claim that it was part of a sinister new game called Snap, where boys would walk by and break one of the bracelets, and determined by the color, the girl would have to immediately perform the indicated sex act for the boy. There's no real evidence that either of these urban legends have any basis in reality, but they're still talked about even now as evidence that kids these days are out of control, a feeling that seems to repeat with the new, slightly more shocking trends of each generation. Let's start with the first generation of American teenagers, who were beginning to form a brand new identity, full of new freedoms and righteous rebellion, ready to decide things for themselves. As the thousands of teenaged veterans returned as shell-shocked adults from the extreme violence of World War I, the youth heading into the 1920s was profoundly angry with the older generation for creating the hellish reality that so many of their own had been living in, and they showed more distrust, less willingness to simply conform to their parents' wishes. With the sudden economic upturn of the Roaring '20s, young people finally had freedom to leave the days of child labor behind, and those that had the means to party certainly did. America soon got to know their very first counterculture, led in part by young girls who had experienced expanded horizons while working as part of the war effort, and were much more liberated than anyone had ever seen. Nicknamed flappers, these teenage girls and young women cut their hair short and wore short dresses. They drank, smoked, and danced, and canoodled with boys they were not set to marry, a very different picture from the way young women had acted in the generations before. Almost immediately, these flappers were seen as a brand new national threat. An op-ed from 1922 from a concerned mother claims that these vampire women, which they called vamps, were preying on their good little boys, claiming her son had recently confided,
"Mother, it is so hard for me to be decent and live up to the standards you have set me, and to always keep in mind the loveliness and purity of girls. How can I do it with this cheek dancing? And if I pull away, they call me a prude. And when I take a girl home, in the way that you have told me is the proper fashion, she is not satisfied and thinks I'm slow."
The dances this concerned letter likely referred to were the hip products of jazz, widely called the devil's music. With its unstructured freedom, its beating rhythms and moaning tones, the style it inspired certainly broke social norms. Jazz and swing were the creations of black musicians who played in Prohibition-era mob-run city dance halls to swarms of increasingly white teenagers. Conservatives and aging feminists alike shunned these places as dangerous for vulnerable young women, with the president of the General Federation of Women's Clubs stating, as she led her personal crusade against the new culture, that, quote, "Jazz was originally the accompaniment of the voodoo dance, stimulating half-crazed barbarians to the vilest of deeds." For the first time in U.S. history, both white teenagers and black teenagers were hanging out together in unregulated and, more importantly, unsegregated spaces, much to the true horror of the white parents. Suddenly, new and seriously controversial dances began making the rounds among the white teenagers. The monkey glide, the turkey trot, the grizzly bear, the camel walk, the horse trot, the crab step, the chicken flip, the kangaroo dip, and the bunny hug. These so-called animal dances were accused of being like mating rituals inspired by the primal sexuality of the beasts. Moral crusaders said that they could lead to a barnyard morality, as well as, most horrifyingly to parents, their young white girls and boys landing in the arms of a black teenager. These dances, which by our standards are hilariously tame, seriously go watch some videos of them, so scandalized the nation that they were banned from the White House by Woodrow Wilson. Undercover cops in major cities were ordered to revoke licenses from dance halls that were caught allowing the turkey trot, and New York Mayor William Gaynor went as far as to claim that animal dances were like lascivious orgies. That was the tune "How You Gonna Stop Their Pettin' Parties" by Pete Wendling. Parents soon caught on to this other shocking trend that teenagers were calling petting parties, where groups of chums would make out near each other. These petting parties might be formal and planned in someone's basement or parked car, or they could break out randomly at the movie theater, on the sidewalk, or at the beach. These petting parties were chances to explore their own sexuality within the limits imposed by the teens themselves, the number one rule being no sex whatsoever. In the South, they were called necking parties. In the West, mushing parties. Fussing parties in the Midwest, and many flappers called it snuggle pupping, and referred to themselves as snuggle pups. As calls to end petting parties were trumpeted in the media, police began responding by throwing ice water on the groups, and even began fining teens for spooning. Petting parties, although certainly enjoyed for their physical side, were no doubt also a public display meant to make a statement against the strict Victorian rules regarding dating. Teenage rebellion continued to be fueled by a distaste for their parents' generation as they experienced the hopelessness of the Great Depression and the horror of World War II, until their identity was finally established for good in the late 1940s, as the Teenage Bill of Rights was printed in the New York Times, marking the first public use of the word teenager. The first time this new identity became official. Such articles included the right to have a say about his own life, the right to have rules explained, not imposed, the right to be at the romantic age, the right to ask questions, and the right to make mistakes and find out for himself. By this point, almost all teenagers for the first time were enrolled in public high school, a place where they could, together, create their own identity with a large group of their peers, in a place that had previously only been used by those affluent enough to not need the labor of their children. It was also a place that became a kind of political battleground as schools were forced to desegregate, with almost all white parents wholly against the concept of their children and teenagers spending so much time around what they continued to see as a corrupting and sexually dangerous influence.
Teenage savages go wild in a juvenile jungle of lust and lawlessness.
Rock and roll was the first type of music specifically marketed to teenagers, as they became the newest obsession of the capitalist machine, and music, movies, cars, and clothes were being pushed to this new favorite consumer, the white suburban teenager with a pocket full of allowance money looking for the next cool thing. Developed out of New Orleans R&B, jazz music, and country and western, black singers like Chuck Berry and Little Richard possessed a nation of screaming fans, many of them young white girls, freaking parents out much the same way that jazz had in the decades before, especially when they found out that the term rock and roll was actually black slang for sex. Teenagers watched live TV through store windows as Elvis Presley put his white face on rock and roll and famously began thrusting his hips, outraging parents with blatant and celebratory sexuality that had previously only been seen in black spaces. Now it seemed to have spread to their own innocent suburban sweethearts, and God only knew what its powers could do. Soon, an urban legend got started, likely from the leftover stories of petting parties combined with the daydreams of the hormonal imagination. Parents soon learned of an apparent new high school fad called non-virgin clubs and had actually begun pulling their kids out of class. The stories went that these clubs were full of promiscuous young women who had banded together to seduce teenage boys into at-school orgies. In Memphis, one such group apparently required that each girl have 13 sexual partners before she was allowed to join. Parents claimed the names of each participating teen were placed into a hat and then were drawn at random, forming the sexual pair for that club's meeting. These legends merged with more overt fears of integration when white parents and their kids gossiped about a black man named Sneaky Pete, who apparently gave liquor to and held wild sex parties for teenage white girls in his creepy one-room rundown shack. No evidence of these orgies, whether in classroom or shack, has ever been found. With these early relatives of the Rainbow Party came more rumors from that sex den of high school, ones that would eventually morph into the stories of sex bracelets, alleging that boys were using pull tabs from a soda or beer can to convince girls to sleep with them. The rules of the game said that if the ring of the pull tab was broken, it was worth a kiss, but if it could be removed without breaking it, it was good for sexual intercourse.
More after this. And now, back to the show. As we'll see in next week's episode, the streaking craze that we lovingly covered in our episode of the same name actually had a very direct impact on the invention of the thong as we know it today. Colleges all over the country were swept up in a trend of running naked across lawns, through classrooms, through towns, and even through public hearings about streaking on campus and off. 1974 was the landmark year of public nudity, and the trend of that college-level nakedness spread to the city-owned beaches of LA, where those who believed the human body was a natural sight and those who believed it was inherently obscene faced off in a legal battle. The public controversy actually opened up a space for a popular avant-garde designer to create a piece of swimwear that could toe the legal line, giving the people the nakedness they desired and the authorities the minimum coverage they demanded. So here it is, an excerpt from our 2023 episode called The Streaking Craze.
Tonight, live, the 46th Annual Academy Award presentation.
It was the evening of April 2nd, 1974, and actor David Niven was in the middle of introducing Elizabeth Taylor so that she could reveal the Academy Award for Best Picture, the crescendo of the opulent annual event. David, in his neat tuxedo and bow tie, heard the crowd react before he could see what they were reacting to. A shaggy-haired and shaggy-mustached 33-year-old man jogging naked across the legendary stage, flashing a confident peace sign out to millions of American viewers.
Is a very important contributor to world entertainment, and someone, quite likely,
The streaker's name was Robert Opal, and he was a man who seemed to have pulled off the impossible, claiming he snuck backstage at the most prestigious awards show in the world while disguised as a press photographer, able to pass through several rounds of some of the toughest security in history. When he ran across the camera's shot, the bottom half of his body was cut off at just the right spot so as not to reveal his, well, let's let David Niven tell his legendary joke that even my granny remembered word for word when I asked her about it 50 years later.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was almost bound to happen. But isn't it fascinating to think that probably the only laugh that man will ever get in his life is by stripping off and showing his shortcomings.
After the streaker had struck and gone, Elizabeth Taylor just could not hold it together.
Francis Ford Coppola, producer. I'm nervous. That really upset me. I think I'm jealous.
It was a shocking, seemingly unsanctioned interruption, the kind that many of us dream of seeing whenever we watch anything live. And this streak was certainly the most memorable Oscars moment up until the 2022 Oscars slap. Surprisingly, Robert's stunt did not lead to a dramatic tackle and subsequent arrest for attempting to show his naked body to an entire nation. Instead, he was welcomed on to Winners Row, where he was allowed to hold a press conference, posing for photos and answering questions from excited reporters. Robert Metzel, the event's longtime business manager, told the LA Times a couple years later that he believed the whole thing to be staged, and that his wife claimed that David borrowed a pen from her in the lobby so that he could mark down his shortcomings quip before he actually went on stage. But others claimed that the stunt was all Robert, a man already known for other such provocative pranks. But regardless of whether this was truly one of the most impressive tricks ever pulled off on national TV, or a PR hoax meant to draw more young viewers into what then seemed like a pretty boring annual event, Robert Opel became an instant celebrity, appearing on popular talk shows and even becoming, for a hot second, a professional streaker, paid to zip naked through mansion parties of the rich and famous. But this was far more than just one man daring to bear it all for the bit. It was a culmination of a brief but profoundly popular craze that swept across American colleges in the spring of 1974. With reports of streaks through college sports games, college classrooms, across downtowns, large and small, interrupting city council meetings, once even gracing the halls of Wall Street's Chase Manhattan Plaza. During a Beach Boys concert, two naked men ran across the stage, revealing themselves to be Mike Love and Dennis Wilson. Even Snoopy streaked during the craze, appearing as his alter ego, big man on campus, Joe Cool. He tossed off his sunglasses, removed his collar, and went streaking through the fourth panel of the Peanuts comic. Tonight Show host Johnny Carson declared that streaking offered a whole new meaning to the term big man on campus. Walter Cronkite, one of the most famous voices working in the media at that time, called the craze a, quote, grand spring adventure. And as is true with any fad, merchandisers pumped out the kitsch, streak freak buttons, keep on streaking t-shirts and patches, mugs, necklaces, pink underwear printed with the words too shy to streak, and the best one, a novelty wristwatch featuring a streaking Richard Nixon. A novelty country song topped the Billboard Hot 100 chart for 3 weeks straight, selling over 5 million copies, surrounded by dozens of other songs that used the craze as their theme. But then, just as soon as the streak peaked on a national television awards show, after it essentially had gone completely viral, the trend started to dissipate away. Eventually, it would take its place as a run-of-the-mill prank, still performed once in a while at sports games or on prank shows like Jackass, or across college lawns as rites of passage. The same college lawns where naked ghosts of the past once ruled the school, and an America overwhelmed by the modern world welcomed these apparently innocent jests warmly, with open but well-clothed loving arms. Adams.
Boogie that, boogie that. Boogie that, boogie that.
And he ain't wearing no clothes.
Oh, yes, they call him the street. Fastest thing on 2 feet. He's just as proud as he can be of his anatomy. He gon' give us a peek. Oh, yes, they call him the street. Likes to turn the other cheek. He's always making the news, wearing just his tennis shoes. Guess you could call him unique.
Legend has it that when it comes to the American history of running naked in public for attention, it all began at the most elite academic institution in the nation, where the most brilliant minds of the next generation are molded into the great leaders of the future. In 1785, Charles Adams, the son of the second president of the United States, John Adams, participated with some other 18th century buddies in a drunken streak across Harvard Yard. Though no direct evidence of this exists, local tour guides and history bloggers have long enjoyed relaying this tale as a fun little party fact. But the actual first streak on record came in 1804, when a Washington University student named George William Crump ran down the old colonnade naked, a young man who would later be elected to the United States House of Representatives. Decades later, streaking became a favorite transgression at Washington U, with then college president and former Confederate General Robert E. Lee calling it a hardy, harmless, and masculine prank, blessing the practice as a spring rite of passage. Or, so the legend goes, passed on through institutional lore, tragically with no primary sources to be found. Over the next century, there were only a handful of recorded naked runs, and it wasn't until 1972 that guys at the University of Notre Dame introduced America to the term streaking. They announced a formal Streakers Olympics, which included a marathon made up of mostly young men that made the national news. When other colleges heard about this epic prank, it slowly grew in popularity, and by 1973, the Times was calling streaking a, quote, growing Los Angeles fad. But shit really popped off in January of 1974 when thousands of students from Florida State University, followed by the University of Washington, the University of Maryland, and the University of Texas, got in on the unprecedented unclothed action. And by the early part of May, streaking had made headlines across most, if not all, major newspapers and TV news networks. And then hordes of streakers were seen at colleges like Harvard, Columbia, the University of Missouri, Barnard College, Virginia Polytech, and Virginia State University. At the University of Missouri, 1,500 students watched 15 streakers sprint to a lone trumpeter playing the school's fight song. Students from the University of Tennessee streaked down Cumberland Avenue, somehow getting onto a roof and then on top of a billboard, while still others climbed on top of a statue of a bull to ride naked, rodeo style. At the University of Georgia, 15,000 Athenians lined the route down Sanford Avenue with chairs and coolers of beer, waiting to catch a glimpse of hundreds of these naked students. Even streaking cadets at West Point were reportedly chased around by their fully uniformed superiors. Back at Harvard, students donned surgical masks and streaked through an anatomy exam. The University of South Carolina threw an entire naked carnival, complete with sideshows like a naked Tarzan flexing for the spectators. At both the University of Georgia and Illinois, a handful of students actually skydived naked and then floated down to campus on parachutes with one of these parachuters, as the press called them, landing in an actual cesspool, which is really funny. As fads usually go, this one soon became self-referential, meta, if you will, with Michigan State streakers running through a class called Criminal Sexual Deviation, and even more so when University of Maine students streaked a staff meeting about how to address the issue of campus streaking. As the craze was beginning to show itself, the media was perplexed at how exactly to respond. The New York Times asked, quote,
"Is it an art form? Is it an uncontrollable urge? Is it political, perhaps perverse? Healthy? Naughty?"
But it seems that the majority of administrators and political pundits agreed that it was all just harmless fun, rather than something lewd or offensive. Though a few university officials condemned the activities and sought to punish or even expel those who joined the festivities, most school administrators, politicians, and media personalities were largely unconcerned and even tickled pink by the whole affair. The official statement out of Northwestern University was, quote,
"We'd like to leave it alone. After all, it's springtime."
The official policy out of the University of Georgia was non-interference. It's true that a bill was introduced in South Carolina that would require expulsion and 90 days in jail for anyone caught streaking, but that never really went anywhere. Fines for the prank were far more common, with the University of Texas taking $50 per streak, but sometimes, if it was all disruptive enough, closer to $200. At one school, the Association for Student Streakers, or ASS, began collecting donations to pay the fines of their cohorts. The National Safety Council actually released official safety tips for streakers. The council made it clear that they did not condone streaking themselves, but they wanted to be a cool mom about it. If you're gonna streak, I'd rather you do it safely. Considerations included wearing sneakers, as, quote, "a cut foot could end a streaking career prematurely." Participants must also opt to wear reflector tape stuck to both their front and back to create what the council called headlights and taillights, and to watch out for hazards like open manholes and barbed wire fences. Oh, and lastly, make sure you remember your glasses. Okay, thanks, Mom.
That'll do it for this installment of Context Clues. Make sure you do not miss next week's episode called Thongs. This was American Hysteria. In the meantime, you can check out our full episodes of Teenage Sex and the Streaking Craze. If you want to support our show and get ad-free episodes as well as bonus content, you can head to patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. You'll get access to the other podcasts that I do with our producer Miranda, where we tell you stories related to the topics that we're covering or stories that we just know that you'll love. That's patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. If you're feeling generous, you can also leave us a review on the app of your choosing. American Hysteria's producer and editor is Miranda Zickler. Our associate producer and sound designer is Riley Swedelius-Smith, and I'm your host, Chelsey Weber-Smith. Thanks, as always, for listening, and I hope you have a great